welcome to another episode of Data Skeptic Animal Intelligence. Today we're going to do a little rebroadcast. This is actually an older episode if you're a longtime listener that we originally aired in our first artificial intelligence season. But how fitting to speak to the author of the book Ant Encounters during our more bio-focused season. Becky, were you familiar with this book before listening to the episode?
I was not, but I might have to pick it up now. It sounds really interesting.
It was a great read, yeah, especially at a time when I was just starting to take an interest in ants. Would you say this made any specific aspects of ants more interesting to you?
Made the evolutionary reasons that they do what they do more interesting to me because they seem very lopsided. So after I listened to the episode, I dove into the literature on ant learning and cognition, which is actually pretty scant because one thing you both talked about is they don't necessarily learn really well. And what I found are some papers where they learn very specific things really well, but they're not broad learners. So I'm really interested in eusociality and evolution and how it produces these automatic sort of algorithmic responses to different stimuli in the environment versus when do you need to learn and when do you need to be flexible? And I think those are super interesting questions. And y'all talk about that a fair bit in the interview.
Individual ants don't seem to learn except on maybe special occasions. How do you feel about this idea that maybe the colony as a whole has its own version of, first of all, learning or maybe cognition, or if we really want to stretch the definitions, maybe it's sentient in its own way?
Yeah, we could say that because humans do a lot of cooperative behaviors too, where we have these emergent properties of societies in terms of things that get done. So I think that's an interesting question from an intellectual point of view, like what is it? And we see this a lot in evolution, especially of eusocial insects, where do we measure selection at the level of the colony, all the individuals, or just the queen, and things like that. So I think I'd need to read more about that to give you a more definitive opinion.
Sure. I think maybe some grants are in order to really answer the question, but yeah.
Yeah. Call up the NSF. We're ready. But I do think those are really important and interesting questions.
Any other takeaways on your end?
And you both talk about this just a little bit, but I think the point needs to be belabored just a little bit, is that ants are a family within the Hymenoptera, which includes your bees, wasps, all that stuff. But each genera, each genus in that family have very wildly different life histories and evolutionary pressures. So you can't necessarily study instinctual behavior, algorithmic type behavior, learning behavior in one ant genus and say this applies to everybody. So I think if we keep studying ants, we're going to find all kinds of cool little, maybe gotchas isn't the right word, but little mechanisms for getting things done that don't exist in other species. So they're very much worth investigating. Like I found a study on an ant, Lasius niger. They punished them for using pheromone trails to find food. And both of you talk about pheromone trails. And they learned to not use the pheromone trails anymore. They were like, no, I don't want to go get shocked. But what they didn't learn is that the good stuff, the sugar, is in the trail without pheromones. Like they only got as good as chance. So they did learn to avoid the trail, but they never learned that avoiding it is what gets you food. So I'm like, that's really bizarre. I think making sure that knowing that ants are a really big family, really diverse life histories, and you're going to find all kinds of cool stuff the more you study them. They're going to be really different from one another.
And lots of opportunities to compare and contrast then. I think there are some true learnings for researchers to have here in learning theory and agency and all stuff like that.
Yep, you made me a believer. We need more funding for the ants.
Absolutely. Hopefully that comes out of this. Well, let's jump right into the episode. Deborah, welcome to Data Skeptic.
Thanks. It's great to be here.
So I completed your book, Ant Encounters, earlier this year. I want to say something, and I don't mean this as hyperbole, but I really thought it was a page-turner, and I couldn't put it down.
That's great.
That's not something you often say about nonfiction. For those who haven't had the pleasure yet, can you describe what the book is all about?
The book is an introduction to the idea that the way that an ant colony works without central control is to use patterns of simple encounters. So ants respond to the rate at which they meet other ants, and in the aggregate, that regulates the behavior of the colony.
Yeah, it's that frequency that was very interesting to me. I had not previously been exposed to that idea. Could you tell me maybe a practical example of what ants are doing and how those encounters will alter their behavior?
one example is the behavior of harvester ants in the desert. The foragers go out and search for seeds, and then they come back and they're inside the nest for a little while until they go out on their next trip. And an outgoing forager uses the rate at which it meets returning foragers to decide whether to leave again. Since the ants are searching for seeds, the amount of time a forager is outside depends on the availability of food. If there are more seeds out there, they find them more quickly, they come back more quickly, and more ants go out. So it's a simple kind of feedback that links the amount of food out there to the experience of an ant without an ant having to assess how much food there is.
Does that mean that ants are counting?
No, they don't have to count. They only have to use the rate at which they meet.
So tell me a little bit more then about memory. How do they recall those rates?
It works like a neuron. Think about how a neuron decides whether to fire. A neuron gets a charge from another neuron, and when enough stimulation accumulates, the neuron fires. But that stimulus leaks because electrical charge leaks out the body of the axon. Each stimulus has an impact which then decays. If it gets enough stimuli quickly enough before the rest of them have decayed, then it'll fire. And that's how the ants assess interaction rate also. So we used, in fact, a model based on this idea of a leaky integrator, which is what neurons are, to measure the behavior of the ants, and it fit very well. So the idea is that each time an ant experiences an interaction with another ant, it stimulates a neurophysiological response which decays. And if the ants get enough interactions before the last one has decayed, then it pushes the ant over a threshold where it's likely to leave the nest and forage. But if it doesn't get another interaction for a long time, then it kind of forgets anything ever happened and the process has to start again.
So one of the impressions I took away from the book was, and obviously you will see my bias here as a student of computer science, but I felt like, these ants, they're very simple programs. They're executing very basic rules. Do you find that that's a fair assessment?
Yes.
So then where does the intelligence of an ant lie?
Well, ants are really not very intelligent. You could maybe say that colonies are intelligent in that they can adjust to changing conditions and do a lot of complicated things, but really it's not a matter of intelligence, it's a matter of how all of those very simple interactions in the aggregate produce an outcome, and that's very analogous to a computer.
Yeah, there's certainly an emergent property to it when these simple procedures kind of fit together very well, I guess. Would it be fair to say then that ant behavior is really more the product of evolution than of learning?
Well, absolutely, yes. So these algorithms, these simple rules that the ants are using are the product of evolution. So what's evolving is the way that the rules that put together simple interactions produce some outcome in the behavior of the colony, and that's what natural selection acts on.
So do ants get, I know they specialize to some degree in tasks. Are they able to improve and learn something about their task over their lifetime?
Well, first of all, they don't specialize as much as people may think. Mm-hmm. I know it's part of the sort of popular version of ants that each ant has its job. In the movie Ants, each larva is assigned its task at birth by a bureaucrat with a clipboard. But in fact, ants do move from one task to another. Early on in many species, and of course we don't know what goes on in most species, but the ones we do know about, the ants work inside, maybe taking care of the other younger ants, the juvenile forms, the larvae and the pupae, when the ant is young, and later in its life it moves to work outside the nest and to forage. An ant moves through a series of tasks. But to get back to your question, we don't really have any evidence that an ant gets much better at a task by doing it.
With ants then not being specialists the way popular opinion seems to have formalized, how does an ant determine if and when they should switch their task?
Again, they seem to use the rate of encounters. We can do experiments in which we change the need for ants performing some task, and ants will switch tasks in response. It seems as though when there's some condition that creates a need for more ants, maybe the ants meet, for example, more ants doing cleanup work, and there's some positive feedback on that, so ants are more likely to switch when they meet other ants doing a certain task. Probably the rules for switching tasks depend on encounter rate, and we have found that for some tasks in some species. We don't know yet if that's generally true, but it looks like it may be.
Yeah, that's another great point. I mean, ants seem to be a pretty diverse label. Can you talk a little bit taxonomically about the amount of species there are and the diversity and evolutionary path they've taken?
I want to give a personal thank you to our latest sponsor, Delete Me. They have helped me out. Text DATA, D-A-T-A, to 64,000. They'll text you back so you can start exploring if this is the right solution for you. Delete Me finds and removes any personal information you don't want online. I was very surprised how much they found on me. They can get things removed and they can make sure it stays off. Delete Me is a subscription service that removes your personal information from the largest people search databases on the web. And in the process, it helps you prevent possible ID theft, doxing, phishing scams, and a dozen other situations where you gotta waste hours of your time cleaning up a mess someone else caused. I'm glad to have Delete Me set up. I'm done with robocalls. I'm almost done with calls in general as a result of all the robocalls. Sign up and provide Delete Me with exactly what information you want deleted, and their experts take it from there. Delete Me will send you regular personalized privacy reports showing what they found, because it's not just a one-time service. They're constantly monitoring. Delete Me has your back. Take control of your data and keep your private life private by signing up for Delete Me. Now at a special discount for our listeners, today we get 20% off Delete Me plans by texting DATA, D-A-T-A, to 64,000. That's text DATA to 64,000. The only way to get your 20% off is to text DATA to 64,000. That's DATA to 64,000. Message and data rates may apply. See terms for details.
Can you talk a little bit taxonomically about the amount of species there are and the diversity and evolutionary path they've taken?
There are 14,000 species of ants that have been named so far. There are probably many going extinct in the tropical forest as the tropical forests are being cut down while we're having this interview, so we don't know how many there are. There are probably many more species than that. They've been around for about 130 million years, and they're very, very diverse. So there are ants that live in every conceivable habitat on Earth. They're everywhere, and they make a living in all kinds of amazing ways. They nest in the ground, they nest in trees, they nest in the burrows of other insects, they nest all over the place, they eat all kinds of things. So they're really very diverse. And we've studied only a tiny fraction of the ants. So there are maybe 50 species that anybody's ever looked at in detail. And so that leaves 13,950 that we don't know much about.
Well, a good opportunity for grad students, I suppose.
Yeah. Yeah, there's a lot to learn about ants.
Well, we've had some hot days. On an especially hot day, I like to get cool. One thing that hasn't happened yet is a surprising encounter you mentioned in the book. Where might those ants go?
They might go anywhere in the walls of your house. They might come up through the drains. But eventually they'll go back outside because they prefer to be outside.
Oh, I was thinking specifically of the calls you sometimes get where people are surprised to find a big cluster in their home freezers.
Oh, yes. So they're attracted. If you have a freezer that has a top compartment and it has a liner, there's something in the liner on the freezer door that they like. A thing about Argentine ants, and there are other species of ants like this, is that they lay trail pheromone everywhere they go. So trail pheromone is a chemical that they put down on the surface where they're walking, and an ant will follow that scent. So it's another kind of interaction with a short lag. One ant puts out the chemical, the other ant finds it and tends to go in that direction. But they don't do what you might think is the ordinary way that ants use trail pheromone. It's not that they go find the freezer and go back and tell everybody. They're just putting down pheromone as they go. So if a few ants get into the freezer because they're inspecting the liner, then they're going to pull other ants in behind them because everybody's laying pheromone as they go, and so you end up with a lot of dead ants in the freezer. Well, it's not very adaptive, but they haven't really evolved to deal with freezers.
Yeah, that was going to be my next question. That's obviously kind of, I'm thinking of ants as computer programs, if you'll humor me with that. And this is like a bug in the software. Evolution will have to fix it, but how detrimental is it to the colony in the meantime?
They tend to be pretty big. By the time they're getting into people's houses, it's probably a pretty big colony. The part of the colony, the nest that's inside the house, is only a small part of a larger colony that in the summer consists of many nests, and then in the winter they contract back into a big single one. So losing a bunch of workers probably isn't going to kill the colony. But they've only had, 100 years to respond to freezers, maybe not that much. And in 130 million years, that's not very long.
Oh, very good observation, yeah. I think most people have the general idea that ants tend to communicate via pheromones. Can you tell me the extent to which they have developed, would we call it a language of scent? How do you think of it?
Ants do produce many different chemicals, so they have a lot of glands, each of which produces a different chemical. And they also are covered with a layer of grease that they spread on themselves and on each other by grooming. It keeps them from drying out. Many kinds of insects have this layer of, they're called cuticular hydrocarbons, and they use those as well. But to get to language means that there's a kind of a correspondence or even use of the chemicals as a symbol. This means this and this means that. And it seems pretty clear that they're not using the chemicals as symbols. Instead, you could say that they, again, have these basic rules that do link some kinds of behavior to encounters with some kinds of odors. So they use these chemicals spread on their bodies to distinguish who belongs to the same colony and who doesn't. And also, at least in some species we've studied, the ants performing different tasks come to smell different, so they can distinguish a forager from a nest worker.
Listeners, I want you to head over to brilliant.org/dataskeptic, all one word. If you haven't checked it out yet, you really need to look into Brilliant. It's math and science done right. Brilliant helps you learn more efficiently than lectures through interactive problem-solving based courses. These courses are really well paced and subdivided in this excellent way where they go lesson to lesson and you build up concepts as you go. It's the kind of thing you can do in your spare time or really commit a whole evening to. Either way, it'll fit your schedule. Their courses have memorable examples and they teach in this interactive visual way. Listen, I know probably the majority of you need to brush up on your linear algebra. I want you to think about doing that with Brilliant. They've got a great course in that. Myself, I just started Quantum Objects. Yeah, I know a little bit about quantum circuits, but I want to broaden that and understand more about quantum mechanics, and Brilliant's one of my first choices to help do that. See if all the interactive quizzes and guided tutorials are right for you. There are tons of courses and more being added all the time in math, science, and CS. Check it out for yourself at brilliant.org/dataskeptic. So if individual ants' behavior is relatively predictable, it seems like we could build good computer simulations. Does that happen to be true in practice?
Yes, we do that all the time.
And how do you measure how closely they describe behavior? Because it seems to me that the colony emerges into these complex behaviors from simple rules, and that does seem to be a challenge to sometimes simulate. Meaning, it's a very stochastic process.
Any kind of modeling has the issue that you can construct a model that looks like the behavior you're trying to describe, but there could be an infinite number of models that would give the same outcome. So when you produce a model and it looks like the behavior that you see in the real world, that doesn't prove that that's how the world works. Still, that's the first step. So, for example, when we were looking at the reaction of the harvester ants to encounters in their foraging decisions using the leaky integrator model, what we did was to create simulations using the model based on parameters that we got from the data and then look to see if the model behaves in the way that the ants did. That is, can we use that model to predict the behavior of other ants? And when that fits pretty well, then we can say, okay, we have a model that describes the behavior. We can't say for sure that the ants might not be doing it some other way, but now we have an explanation. So we use simulations for that.
Very neat. I would imagine that there aren't standard off-the-shelf ant simulation software packages. Can you tell me a little bit about how you manage the simulations?
Yes, another one that we just published is about the trail networks of an arboreal ant species called turtle ants that I've been studying in the trees in Mexico and working with collaborators at UC San Diego, Saket Navlaka, and his grad student, Arjun Chandrasekhar. We just published a simulation of how the ants choose the junctions that they take in the vegetations. These ants stay in the trees. They never go to the ground. They can't, fly through the air. So an ant, as it's walking along, can only go where there's a little stem or a vine or something to walk on. And at every junction in this tangle of vegetation, the ant has to decide which way to go. And they use trail pheromone like the Argentine ants. They lay trail pheromone as they go. So an ant's decision about which edge to take depends on how much pheromone has been left by the ants that came before. We've been able to show in experiments with ants, not in simulation, that they manage, of course, to find things. They have to find food, so they can't always stay on the same trail or they'd never find anything. So we did some simulations with two parameters. One is the rate of decay of the pheromone, which sets how long at a given junction, how long an ant is likely to turn the same way as the previous ant before the pheromone, which is volatile, has decayed. So one parameter is the decay of the pheromone, and the other parameter is the probability of exploring. You could call it searching or making a mistake, or exploring is the same thing, the probability of taking an edge off a junction that wasn't the one that had the most pheromone. So going the wrong way, which is how they find things. And with just these two parameters, we were able to recreate the behavior of the ants in a simulation, which is, in a way, much simpler than what the ants are doing because it's just a 2D grid, a graph, and the ants make choices at the corners. And still, it was sufficient to show a lot of similarities to what the ants are doing. In particular, what we did was to look to see what would be the parameter values that would work best in the simulation. For example, when there's a rupture, which frequently happens to the real ants, a lizard runs through and it breaks a little vine and the ants have to find another path. And I have been doing experiments in which I cut the branch and see how the path recovers. So we looked to see what were the parameter values in the simulation that would make the ants most successful in maintaining a trail and in repairing one. And those turned out to match quite well the values that the ants are actually using, which we could measure. So again, that doesn't prove that the ants are using an algorithm like the one that we simulated, but it shows that the one that we simulated is consistent with the one that the ants are using. And now we're working to incorporate some of the variability that we see in the vegetation into the model. So having got this simple model that seems to basically predict how the ants are making these trail networks, now we're going to add another layer of complexity that corresponds to what we see in the real world.
Very neat. It seems like the simplicity of ant behavior makes this, I guess I want to use the word rigor, a little bit more rigorous than some experiments with behavior. You could do experiments on humans, but we're very complicated. Ants, you can have a testable hypothesis, and it's, as you said, you can readily confirm it. It makes verifiable predictions, and it's also falsifiable.
Yes.
If you create a scenario where you predict one and you don't see the behavior. It seems like it works like clockwork. Is that how you guys explore hypothesis testing when doing ant research?
Yes, but I wouldn't say it works like clockwork because ants aren't really fully deterministic. They don't always do the same thing in the same conditions. So you have to be ready for a lot of noise and you have to have a lot of patience because if you expect the ant to do the right thing every time, you'll be disappointed.
Gotcha. So those rules are actually probabilistic then, is that right?
Yes, it's all stochastic, yes.
Very fascinating. I know you've just gotten back from doing some field work. Can you tell me a little bit about that and why you have to go to the field? Why can't we do everything in a laboratory?
Well, in the laboratory, we can ask ants to solve problems that we create, but we can't learn about the problems that they're actually solving without seeing what they're really doing. The main thing that any organism, including ants, have to do is to respond to the way that the environment changes. So in the lab, we can't create the dynamics that ants or any other organism has evolved to deal with. So I think sometimes we have to do things in the lab because we can't see everything in the field, but in the lab, ants don't do all the amazing things they do in the field, and we can't see the environment that they've evolved to deal with. So I love to watch ants in their natural environment because that's where all the cool things that they do are really happening.
Yeah.
And I was working in Mexico with these arboreal ants that I was just talking about, the turtle ants. And what we were doing this time was to try to understand not just how they make the choices that they do, but to try to characterize the topology of the network that they're searching in order to understand why they don't go some places and do go others. So we spent a lot of time mapping the nodes that they didn't take to try to characterize the shape and the connectivity of the vegetation and understand how they make their choices.
One of the things that was kind of impressive to me in the book was your discussion of an experiment you did to test for diplomacy. Because I think of that with, obviously a very human bias here, but that's, to me, an advanced component of intelligence. It requires one to have some social instincts and think about other people and other groups of people. Can you talk about that experiment and what we know about the degree to which ant intelligence has advanced in the directions human intelligence has?
Ant colonies have neighbors and they have to interact with the other colonies, and this is, of course, an ongoing process that happens through repeated encounters. In the lab, we had 2 different colonies and a plexiglass barrier with a cute little door that we could open to let ants go through. We had the individuals marked, so these are harvester ants. They're pretty big, and you can mark them by putting a colored paint on them, and once the paint dries, they don't smell it, and they're fine, and we can tell who's who. And we wanted to know whether the same ants would be the ones that would be interacting with their neighbors. This is based on some earlier work which showed that colonies respond differently to encounters with their neighbors, who they meet over and over, than to encounters with ants much further away. And so we wanted to see if that was because particular ants were specialized in encountering their neighbors. So we looked to see whether ant number 72 with a blue dot on its head and a green dot on its abdomen would be the one that would go in, cross through the opening that we created and interact with the other colony. And we found out that that was not the case. And that actually led much later on to a model that isn't mentioned in the book because we did it since I wrote the book. And this was with Fernando Esponda, who is a computer scientist and works in computer security. We were able to model this behavior as a distributed algorithm. And so the idea is that each ant has a boundary in the space of possible odors that distinguishes the ants that it calls nestmates, that it recognizes as belonging to the same colony, and the ants that are not nestmates. And that over time, as it has encounters with other ants, that boundary shifts. But each ant is different. Each ant smells slightly different, and each ant has a different boundary. And so at any time, an encounter between neighboring colonies depends on which ants happen to meet and whether they identify the ants that they meet as being a nestmate or not a nestmate. Maybe the explanation for why colonies respond differently to their neighbors than to strangers is not because certain ants know the smell of the neighbors, but because the probability is high that the same ants will happen to meet the same neighbors over and over, whereas those ants will never have encountered colonies from far away, and so they might not respond to that smell as being a non-nestmate. So it is an alternative to the idea that every ant has kind of a passport. It has a certain smell that it identifies as the colony smell, and if it meets an ant with the wrong passport, it reacts. Instead, it's more like the immune system in a mammal. Like in a person, our immune system consists of many cells, each of which is tuned to recognize a different pathogen that it's met before. That's why we have vaccines, so that we will create cells that will recognize a certain pathogen. And the immune response is this aggregate distributed response that depends on which cells happen to meet which pathogens. It's not that every cell knows everything that's supposed to be us and everything that's supposed to be other, but it's an aggregate response.
I'm certainly impressed by the amount of interesting work that has and advancements and things we've learned about ants and follow up on some of the bibliographic references from the book. But as you mentioned, there's 14,000 something species. There's certainly a limit to what we know. What are some of the interesting or questions that most interest you that are open about studying this, genus, or at what level do we study ants?
They're a family with many genera. Well, I think that ants are a great opportunity to think more generally about the match between the dynamics of the environment and the dynamics of their behavior. So we know that ants use these distributed algorithms to generate their behavior and that they can adjust to environmental change. And it's an opportunity to see what kinds of algorithms work best in which kinds of changing conditions. I think it's a great opportunity to make comparisons among species that live in very different kinds of conditions and ask how they operate differently.
And specifically to the artificial intelligence community, do you have any advice for what they can learn from studying research like yours?
I think that the main lesson of the ants is that you can get something that looks like intelligence without a lot of intelligence. So what's really most intriguing to me about ants is how messy and noisy the system is, and it still works.
Well, Deborah, to wind up, I definitely want to encourage people to go to Amazon or their bookseller of choice and pick up Ant Encounters. I can't recommend it enough. Where else can people follow you online and learn about your work?
Well, they can go to my lab website. So if you look me up, you'll get to my lab website. It's hard to spell it out, but I'm Deborah M. Gordon, and I'm at Stanford, and it's easy to find. And on the homepage, there's a section which has some of the popular articles I've written and links to TED Talks, and I think that'd be the best place to start.
Wonderful. I'll have some of those things in the show notes for people to follow up on as well. Deborah, thank you again for taking the time to come on. This has been a really interesting conversation.
Thanks very much. Great to talk to you.